quick survey. How many people here like history? Anyone? Okay, that's a good number. That's a good number. Anyone here doesn't like history? Oh, we've got one. Okay, that's a pity. I was going to tell you all about what I did this weekend, but it's history, so you won't be interested. That was something which I think Brother Bob Lloyd once said, and it stuck in my mind because it, you know, everything in context, history has a massive effect on us, and really when we say we don't like history, if that's the case, we're actually just saying we don't like particular kinds of history, because that's so much what we talk about is history. You know, talk about what the weather was like last weekend, or you know, what we did last weekend. You know, spend so much time in the past we do, and I am sorry for people who don't like a lot of history, but we are going to be doing a little bit of history this morning. Hopefully it won't be too dry. It won't be about what I did on the weekend, because that's probably quite boring. But my thoughts, particularly around this subject, the end of the age, I guess was sparked by Reese last week, was talking about Jeremiah and Lamentations. And Jeremiah, he lived at the end of an age. And we don't necessarily always realize, you know, when we come to the end of an age, because it's not until we look back at history that it becomes clear that, well, that was the end of an age. I mean, maybe we're going to look back at 2020 and go, that was the end of an age. You know, before then I could hop on an aeroplane and fly to anywhere in the world, but that was the end of an age. Who knows? I don't know at this present point in time, but what we do know is that everything has its age, and in time, everything that we know in the world of men comes to an end. And in Jeremiah's time, his nation came to its end. The very symbol that held their nation together, I guess, the temple, was destroyed and the population was deported. The people came back, things carried on, life carried on, things started again, but that was the end of the age. Nothing was ever the same quite again. Has anyone, I don't know how well that shows up, but has anyone heard of the Alunbaran shipwreck? Anyone heard of that? There you go. We're getting into some history, and this is history that apparently no one knows. So that's really good. Okay, this is a shipwreck that was discovered in 1982. It was about 6 kilometers off the coast of a place in Turkey called Alunbaran. Okay, and it was excavated underwater over 11 seasons. And we could hit you with all sorts of stuff which is going to really turn Michelle off, because it's history. But essentially, this is from what's known as the late Bronze Age, okay? And that's just all jargon. I know that doesn't really mean a whole lot to people, because it really doesn't mean a lot to me either, unless I know how this connects with things which I am interested in. So what is the connection with this time period? Well, the Bronze Age was the time period that Abraham lived in, okay? Now we've got a point of interest. We're all interested in Abraham here, correct? Yep. Great. Okay. Well, Abraham lived in the Bronze Age, and the late Bronze Age is the time period after Abraham. So we are going to be, you know, sort of taking from his time forward. The end of the Bronze Age was, I guess, in the time of the judges. Okay, that gives you some sort of time period without me having to say late Bronze Age and expect you to know all about history and time periods and other stuff, which even I don't know. But what I'm interested about this archaeological discovery of the Lundgren shipwreck, did that go? Yeah, that's a little bit better. That's a reconstruction of the shipwreck. What I'm interested in particularly about this and why I'm talking about this morning, okay, is the insight that this discovery has given to us about the world of Abraham's time and his son's time. And it's a world which we would probably actually a little bit recognize, even though we probably don't really think about it in these terms because we're not interested in history, okay? But his world wasn't that much different to our own. We talk about our world and we use terms like globalization. And if I use that term, you know what I mean, don't you? Talk about a world which is all interconnected, okay? Your clothes here mostly came probably from Asia, okay? Unless you've got, you know, some designer sort of fetishes and a very, very keen sense of national pride, and you support local, you know, manufacturers. But everything in our lives is coming from different parts of the world, okay? My car comes from Japan, okay? Not rich enough to afford European cars. We live in a globalized world. But what this shipwreck tells us is so did Abraham. And we don't necessarily realize that, okay? Abraham lived in a globalized world. I'm going to give you some idea of the cargo that was on this ship. This was a very, very wealthy shipwreck, okay? The cargo of this shipwreck was something which was equivalent to a king's ransom, if you like. It's something which you would expect the wealth of a country to be sending and shipping across. And maybe it was a gift from a king. We don't really know. It may just have been a merchant vessel. Okay, but what's really interesting is what this vessel had on board. Okay, so I'm going to give you an idea of some of the stuff that was on board this ship. Probably the most interesting thing, and the thing which ties us to our time period, the Bronze Age, okay, is this ship was carrying 10 tons of copper ingot, okay, and 1 ton of zinc. Why was it carrying 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of zinc? Someone who works in the metal industry, Robert? Protection. Oh dear. Yes, who was that? Yeah, thank you, Ken. This is the Bronze Age. That is the recipe to make bronze. Okay, this was carrying enough to make 11 tons of bronze. You mix 1 part of zinc with 1 part of copper, and you end up with bronze. This was like the oil of the old globalized world. This was the thing that you traded. Obviously, we traded other things, but it was a massive part of control in the old economy. Who had control of bronze? Okay, so it could be traded, and this is what the ship was doing. It was trading this stuff, okay? As well as that, it was also carrying a whole lot of Canaanite jars, okay? And they were probably most likely made at some part, somewhere in modern day, what we would call Israel, okay? In the jars, one was filled with glass beads. They were filled with also olives. Some of them contained what we would probably know in old terms as terebinth. It's pistachia resin. Okay, it's like an ancient form of turpentine. We also had a whole lot of glass ingots, you know, purple, blue dyed glass in a raw form, but, you know, would be very valued for making jewelry and that sort of thing. Many colors, cobalt blue, turquoise, lavender, okay. Largest number of glass ingots ever found in a wreck was found on this shipwreck. It was also carrying all sorts of other miscellaneous cargo. So it was carrying logs of blackwood from Africa, known as ebony to the Egyptians. It was carrying ivory from both hippopotamus and elephants, okay? It had more than a dozen hippopotamus teeth in it. It was carrying tortoise upper shells, okay? It had ostrich egg shells. It had pottery from Cyprus and oil lamps from Cyprus. It had bronze and copper vessels shaped in different shapes for drinking out of. It had 2 duck-shaped ivory cosmetics boxes. It had a trumpet, had more than 2 dozen seashell rings. It had beads of amber. Do you know where the beads of amber came from? They came from the Baltic, okay, way up north. Okay, so at the moment we've gone right from down in Africa, right to way up in Europe. The zinc itself and the copper, the zinc would have come from Afghanistan. There's not that many zinc mines around in the ancient world. That's why it's such a valuable thing. You have to go to where the stuff is. Zinc would have been coming from Afghanistan. The copper was a little bit more common. The copper probably came from Cyprus or maybe up in what we know today as Turkey. The people on this ship, from some of the objects that were on there, okay, came from all over the show. We had at least one person on there was from Egypt. We were also carrying people though who were Greek, Mycenaean Greek. So they were from the Greek Isles. We also had people from Canaan and Cypriots, okay, on this ship. Very cosmopolitan crew on board this ship. And they can tell that by the various personal items which were amongst all of this other stuff on board this ship. They can also date it to within a fairly certain time period, more or less, because on board was a gold scarab. If you don't know what a scarab is, it's a dung beetle, okay? And this was a gold one, so Egyptians kind of used to worship these little creatures. And this little gold scarab, it had the name of Nefertiti inscribed onto it. So we know that this was after the time of Nefertiti, okay, but obviously before the time of the collapse of the Bronze Age. And when you look at all of that, I was just amazed at all of the products that this ship was carrying and how vast a distance they all came from. Massive distance that this was carrying goods from. Truly a global world, which I had not realized really the full implications of what globalization meant in the time of Abraham. And so when you get into looking at it a little bit, you'll begin to discover kind of just how connected kingdoms were. But once again, you've got to kind of be a little bit interested in history. So has anyone heard of the Amarna letters? No? We have? Yes. So what are the Amarna letters? Yeah. So not just Canaan, they go further afield than that, but mainly between Canaan, okay? So these were diplomatic letters, okay? They're known particularly because they all followed a certain format of politeness, political correctness, okay, in addressing them. But this was particularly, you know, like we know of Solomon that he took many wives, right? Why did Solomon take so many wives? Well, a great majority of those wives were diplomatic wives, okay? They were under the form of diplomacy with all of the connections Solomon had, okay? You would marry someone from the family of that king or kingdom, okay, and swap, and that was a diplomatic relationship, which then was designed to keep peace between your countries, okay? And so these letters were sort of that format, but they were the discussions between these different empires, okay? So the empires around this time mentioned in the Amana letters, you had Babylon, you had Assyria, you had the Hittites, you had Egypt, and you had Mitanni, okay, which I hadn't heard of them either, okay, but they're basically from the area of northern Iraq, okay, so part of the Crescent Fertile Valley, but they were one of the empires. Just because we don't know about them doesn't mean they didn't exist, it's just that we haven't heard of them before, but now you have. And these were all communicating with each other in an organized structure, just like we would expect in our world today, okay? Keeping their globalized economy stable through a diplomatic process, which we don't so much recognize, but it kept peace within their world and their realm. Well, it's always too good to last, okay? The Bronze Age came to an end. It took 50 years to collapse the majority of those empires. They all just disappeared in the space of about 50 years, all except Egypt. Egypt is the only one which remained. Those people of that world, those kingdoms just disappeared. I'm sure the people didn't completely disappear, but the kingdoms that they lived in just disappeared. It collapsed. It just went. Period of 50 years with all of these writings between these different people, and these are, you know, people who are illiterate, and they left records, and the archaeologists find these records, and they're reading the scripts because we've learned to be able to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the script, which was basically mostly used around there, called cuneiform. We can read all of this stuff and we get a really great insight into there. And it's another sort of historical record that we can sort of get an idea about the Bible, which we are interested in, to see it, sort of the other aspects of the world that our brethren were living in at that time. And their world completely collapsed between 1225 BC and 1175 BC. We've got these records, and then they just stop, they cease, all except Egypt, okay? And it's really quite astounding. You go, well, what will cause that to happen? But do you know what? Balaam prophesied that. So I'm going to take you to our first passage, Numbers 24. We all know Balaam, right? He's the one which led Israel into sin by the advice that he gave. He was a prophet of the Lord, and he was hired to try and curse Israel. And he gave a series of prophecies, and I'm interested particularly in just the section regarding the end, which deals with these people at the end time. Okay, so he uttered oracles about the ruin of many nations. Okay, and we're just going to come in at verse 21. Okay, then he saw the Kenites and uttered his oracle. Your dwelling place is secure, your nest is set in the rock, yet you Kenites will be destroyed when Ashur takes you captive. So who's Ashur? Ashur is Assyria. Okay, that was one of those empires, remember, that we talked about was trading with Egypt and talked about was trading with the Hittites. Okay, Hittites were one of the people in the land when Abraham came into the land. If you remember, he had to buy a burial plot off one of the Hittites. Okay, so that was the world back then. And then he uttered his oracle. Who can live when God does this? Ships will come from the shores of Kittim. They will subdue Ashur and Eber. They too will come to ruin. And then Balaam got up and returned and went home. Who would have thought back in Abraham's time that Assyria will come to an end? But Balaam prophesied it, and the records in Egypt confirm that it truly did come to an end. But what I'm interested in particularly is the prophecy that it talks about there, about ships will come from the shores of Kittim. Okay. The collapse of the Bronze Age was a very complex thing. Okay, let's not try and say it's simple, but it is recognized that it was caused as one of the major factors by the invasion of the Sea Peoples. Has anyone heard of the invasion of the Sea Peoples? We have 1, 2, 3. Okay. More of you have heard about the invasion of the Sea Peoples than you realize. Has anyone heard about Philistines? You've all heard of Philistines, yeah? Cool. Well, if you've ever noticed, the nations which are mentioned to Abraham don't include the Philistines. And there's a reason for that. That's because the Philistines, when they end up in the land, they're a part of the invasion crew, one of many nations, okay, which is a part of the Sea Peoples. And it wasn't just people by the sea, it's just that a lot of them came by sea, but they also came by land, okay. They were a part of this prophecy of Balaam, okay. Ships will come from the shores of Kittim. Kittim is Cyprus. That doesn't mean that that is where they all originated from, because when you look at the names which are given in the Egyptian record, okay, they came from all over the show. We can't tell all of the places they came from. They came from way over Sicily way and Sardinia. They also came from the Greek Isles, okay, and probably worked their way across gradually down by land as well, because we had the Hittites destroyed, the Assyrians destroyed, and then they came to the gates of Egypt, okay, and did a massive battle, few massive battles with the Egyptians as well. And they're known as the Sea Peoples. We don't know a lot about them. They're discovering as much as they can through archaeology about these peoples. But what we do know is they came and the world was never the same again. And the Bronze Age collapsed. What caused all of these people to move? Well, we don't really fully know that either. But what we have learned from archaeology and science is that the world was undergoing change as a whole. It has been discovered that there was a volcanic eruption up in Greenland, which they estimate would have caused 300 years of climate change. And they know and they see the effects on the populations around that time to know that there was massive climate change. People shifted their areas of habitation because their agriculture collapsed. Areas which were marginal for growing food now became impossible. So they had to shift. And then also at the same time, they've discovered that there was an earthquake swarm that happened up and around the area of Turkey. Constant earthquakes happening, disrupting people's lives, making them fearful and scared. And a massive population from the area around Europe was on the move. And they moved by ship and they moved by land and they came along and they conquered. And over the space of 50 years, the world as we know it collapsed. When the sea peoples arrived at Egypt, okay, they didn't just come by boats with fighting armies. They'd been raiding for years before that happened. But when they arrived at the gates of Egypt, it's recorded and shown in the glyphs which the Egyptians recorded that they came with their families. There's the kids and granddad on the ox cart, okay? And they came to do battle with the Egyptians, but they weren't just coming to raid, they were coming to stay. They had mass migration. The whole world was in upheaval. And so Egypt was the last empire and the only one to complete the record of that time. And here's something which was written in one of the recordings from Egypt from that time, which has been translated. It says, no land could stand before their armor. From Hatti, that's the name for the Hittites, Kodi, Carchemish, Carchemish is the capital of the Assyrians, Ezwa, Elishah, on being cut off. So the Egyptians record that all of their trading partners were completely destroyed and cut off by this invasion force. Egypt also had a great battle. Egypt won. They stopped this invasion of the sea peoples. But Egypt was so depleted afterwards that they had no money left in their coffers after the wars. You'll see after that time period, they had the strikes from all of the workers building the pyramids because they weren't getting paid anymore. So Egypt's pyramid building came to an end. All of that great infrastructure of Egypt stopped because Egypt, even though it survived, became a depleted power. And then they had all of these people left over after the war. So what to do with them? And it is surmised that Egypt settled the peoples that they absorbed after this invasion, including the Philistines, along that coastal area, which is why the Philistines suddenly appear into our record in the scriptures, and David's doing battle with the Philistines. And other names have disappeared because that the world has changed. So the question is, how does that compare with now? What implication does that have for you? Have you got any prophecies that tell you that something similar is going to happen for your generation and your time? What about climate change? Have you seen any climate change happening? Earthquakes, floods or volcanoes? Okay, what about mass migration? Have you seen any of that happening in your world? What about political unrest and wars? See, our world is no different. We're a globalized world, and maybe it only takes one thing like a little virus to tip that organized civilization on its head and bring it to an end. Because we are told and prophesied that it will. Luke 21, and we're going to take a series of verses there, verses 10 to 11, and then 25 to 28. Prophecy of Jesus. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. Down to verse 25. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars on earth. Nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror and apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. We have the prophecies that exactly the same thing that happened for that world will happen for the world in the time of Christ's coming. Exactly the same factors will be employed to bring the nations of this world to their end. Would our world be more resilient to all of these things? We've had a few disasters, but our world's still going, right? Well, don't put too much trust in it. I'm going to ask you of another event, see if anyone's heard of it. Has anyone heard of the Carrington event? Nope. Have you heard of a solar flare? Okay. Well, the Carrington event happened the last time we had a giant solar flare from our sun affect the Earth. We're going back a few years now. We're going back to 1859. Okay. A little bit of a different world to what we have now compared to then, I know. But you know what, they were still a globalized world. They were still an electronic world, believe it or not. They had telegraph. Can you believe that? Telegraph. That's awesome. We can talk across the world through wires. Well, the Carrington event happened on September 1 and 2, 1859. And we had a solar flare, which is recorded, struck the Earth and messed up with our magnetic field. We had auroras, which could be seen as far south as the Caribbean and as far north from the south as Queensland. And the whole telegraph system around the world went down because it was a geomagnetic storm, okay? In fact, once they turned off the telegraph system, some operators were still able to send telegraphs because of the geomagnetic storm. They still had power in their lines. Well, I'd like you to stop and consider then how much your life now depends on things electronic. Have you got a cell phone in your pocket? Have you used a GPS map system to drive anywhere this weekend? I have, okay. What is the implication for your life if we take all of those things you know, turn them on their head and take them away from you? Because a solar event like that would wipe out every satellite that has been put up into space for the past 50 years. And you wouldn't be getting them back, okay? They would be gone, they would be fried. And what about your car? Has anyone got a car here with a computer inside it? I almost guarantee every one of you has got a car here with a computer inside it. So let us not think that our society is more resilient because we've got technology to help us. We are still under the rule of God. Daniel says when he spoke to the king and gave him the answer to his dreams, he says that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. Okay? God is the ruler, not the world around us. So it brings us then to the question that Peter asks us. Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 2. You'll know this prophecy as well. This is no different to all of the rest of them about the time of the end. Okay, so chapter 3, verses 10 to 13. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming, that the day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in heat. But in keeping with this promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. We know about Abraham and the way he lived in his world. We're not far from it, so let's go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Going to look at a series of verses there, 13 to 16. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return to it. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Did Abraham get involved in the politics of his region that he was living in? He was invited to, but he kept himself distant. He would not allow anyone to get in the way of the promises of God. Well, we're going to be having elections, and sometimes people say we should be more involved in politics. But the reality is the gospel tells us that we already have our king appointed, and that any government in this world is still subject to the will and purpose of God. And he sets them up and he takes them down in spectacular ways, regardless of us. But we need to bear in mind who it is that we serve, because Hebrews contains the promise for us too. Verse 39 of chapter 11 says, "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." The lesson or exhort for today is really all about how we have been called to live our lives. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Take the lesson of Abraham and view your time here with a sense of detachment, knowing how temporary it is, and knowing that this is not what God has planned for you. Know that everything you are familiar with now will come to its end, whether or not you and I live to see the return of Christ. We can be assured, just as Balaam's prophecy and all of them right the way through have come to their fulfillment, that the promises of our Lord's return will come to their fulfillment. So we're going to finish then with a quotation from Ephesians chapter 2, which is along these exact same lines. But it gives us the sense that we're not just aliens and strangers. We have somewhere that we belong, and that's what we need to keep focused on. So Ephesians chapter 2, and we're going to read from verse 11. Therefore, remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth, and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, that done in the body by the hands of men. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you, who once were far away, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace, and in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. And so we have our choice. We can be the citizens of here and now and take our chances on what's to come, or we can choose to be citizens longing for a kingdom, a heavenly kingdom, which will come with the return of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, to seal the deal and to show his love towards us, gave his life, not willing to prolong it. He gave his life so that we too might have life eternal.